All right, welcome everyone. Thanks very much for joining us this afternoon. I know there's a lot of other panels out there, so I really appreciate you taking the time to come and listen to us. And I want to thank South by Southwest for giving us the opportunity to talk. It's always an honor and always a lot of fun. Before we begin, I just wanted to, sort of more out of curiosity, get a sense for what people are doing in this room. How many of you actually are part of the game industry, work for a game developer? Great. And so of those, does anyone actually qualify them to call themselves a UI designer in your title? Great. Excellent. So let's get started. So I obviously sort of wanted to begin a little bit sort of why UI is important. I don't think with this crowd and this conference I really need to explain that. Of course, anytime we sort of interact with a digital medium, usually that interaction is through the UI. And these interactions really can spell the difference between success and failure. So it's just always important to think about the UI, and not only does it sort of influence our effectiveness, but it ends up influencing how we feel about the product. And so it's easy to look at the major successes in the technology industry, sort of Mint and Apple and TiVo, and sort of really point to the UI as being one of the key drivers of their success. And we actually don't think this is any different for games. You can have the best story and the best graphics and the best sound, but all that can be tarnished by a bad UI. So I should point out that neither Corey nor myself are actually working in the game industry right now. And so you could ask yourself, what do UI designers actually know about games? I think these days, actually, the talk is more in the other direction. UI designers are talking a lot about what we can learn from games. I think game mechanics are everywhere now. We see sort of badges and ranking and mayors and points, and I've been to at least 3 different talks which use the word gamification, which, by the way, I really don't like. Yeah, glad we got some fans of that. But we also started to think about, like, if the learnings could go the other way. As UI designers, I think we've sort of developed this unique perspective on the world. We sort of have a tool set, and we sort of use this tool set anytime we interact with something. So, we go to an ATM to get cash out, and we evaluate the UI. And we visit a shopping site, and we instantly become very critical about the flow and the presentation and the action and the sort of checkout flow. To be honest, it can almost be a little bit debilitating because you end up focusing on that surface layer so much that sometimes it's hard to get past that.
Especially to girlfriends. They don't like that at all.
Yeah, we drive our friends crazy with that. And this doesn't stop when we play games. We sit down and play a game, and we have the same sort of thoughts going through our head, and we're sort of constantly thinking about how the UI is working or not working for that game. So we just thought sort of it might be useful for us to share our perspective on this and get your all reaction, especially from other game developers, and try to get a sense like, are we on the right track? Are these kind of things useful for you? So before I get too much further, you might be wondering who we actually are. My name is John Mark Josling. I lead interaction design at a company called Yola. It's a San Francisco-based company that provides tools for small businesses to get online. So we provide a lot of the basic things you need to get your online presence, and we really target on sort of micro businesses. I've been an interaction designer for a while, and before that I was actually a front-end engineer. I've played games all my life. They're really an important part of my life. And I've become increasingly interested in the sort of intersection between UI design and game mechanic design, and figuring out what both disciplines can learn from each other and where they actually sort of mesh really well. Sitting next to me is Corey Chandler.
Hi, my name is Corey Chandler, and I'm a principal interaction designer with a really small design consulting group in the San Francisco Bay Area called Deep Dive Design. I've been there for 2 years. We work sometimes with larger companies like Netflix and Shopping.com, but also a whole lot of smaller startups, which is a lot of fun. Before then, I was actually at eBay as a lead UI designer. I was there for 5 years, primarily working on their search experience. So with that, we're going to get started, but before we dive into the specific heuristics, which we hope people will find helpful, I wanted to articulate a little bit more about this boundary between the game world and the interaction design world, and sort of articulate what my perspective is in terms of some of the boundaries between them. And I think my sense of it is that there's some overlap between them. I think there are specialties between the two, and so I grabbed a couple definitions that might help to put a fine point on it. So game design is the process of designing the content and rules of a game, according to a definition from Wikipedia. Whereas about interface design, the goal is to make the user's interaction as simple and efficient as possible in terms of accomplishing user goals. And so the idea being that, in my mind, when you talk about game design, about whether something is difficult or whether it's fun or those sorts of things, in my mind are kind of in the purview of game design, which is really not our area of expertise. But in terms of when you start talking about things like making things simple and efficient, those are things that we do for a living. And in my mind, some of the one statement I think you could make safely about the two is that really they're both seeking to achieve a net positive user experience, and they want to avoid what I'm calling here unanticipated negative experiences. And so, just to articulate that more clearly, both the game world and the interaction design world have anticipated negative experiences. I mean, negative may be a little bit severe, but in games, you lose. And that's not a surprise to the game designer. They know ahead of time loss is going to take place. This also happens in the interaction design world, outside of games. It's just not as common, but you can think of, for example, in the eBay scenario where they know that people are going to lose. And the users from eBay will talk about how, that's not a great experience at the time to be outbid on something that they really loved. But the designers at eBay know that, and they're not going to remove that element because they know that the actual sort of net experience is actually positive, because when you finally do win that item and the overall sort of perspective, it actually becomes worthwhile to have these anticipated negative experiences. But what about unanticipated negative experiences? And so, and these are present in I think, both the game design and the interaction design world. And so some examples of that, and these are some tools that the designers will use to try to avoid these unanticipated negative experiences. So I don't know if any of you have seen this, but on the left side, what you have is a top-down view of a map in Halo, where it's essentially a death heat map. And so it's showing you where in this battlefield all the people have died. And there's two players and two teams, one spawning and starting on the left side of the screen, the other starting on the right side of the screen. And what you'll notice is that there's something kind of weird, which is that the left side of the screen sort of has too much deaths happening over on the left side. And so that will tell the game designers, hey, there's something wrong here. Even though I tried to make a good experience, there's something negative. There's a negative experience happening here, which now I know about and can try to avoid. And so this is a tool that the game designers can use to avoid an unanticipated negative experience. The corollary in the interaction design world, so we have tools like Site Catalyst and things like that, which show you funnels. And so you can say, oh, that's odd. Why are people dropping off on this flow? Like, it shouldn't be that bad. And so you look in there and you realize, oh, I see, we did something wrong. And so now I can do something to change and prevent that unanticipated negative experience from happening. And so basically, in summary, the thought is that these heuristics that we're providing, we're trying to give you some guidelines to avoid the unanticipated negative experiences within game design, but that are related to interaction design. And so I think you'll see what I mean as we start going into them, which, that said, let's get started. So our first one that we put together was this idea that you want to increase the interaction speed over time. And so essentially, as the users become more experienced with the game, they should be enabled to speed up their interactions. And the ones that should be the most sped up should be the ones that are done the most frequently. And so essentially what we're doing throughout these heuristics, we'll show you some examples of where we think this is not going so great and cases where it is going pretty well. And so one example that I have where this did not go so great is in the case of Borderlands. And so in this use case, what happens is you can play a game, and so I'd set up a game to play with my brother, and we were both going to play split screen and play through the campaign together. And so we'd get together and we'd play, and then maybe a couple of days later we'd continue playing, and a couple of days later we'd continue playing. But it turns out to actually continue playing, there are a couple of steps involved. And it turns out to be more than a couple. And so I went ahead and mapped out every single step. And you don't really need to read the details, but I promise you this is how many actions take place between sort of saying start, choosing split screen, choosing I'm selecting an existing character. Are you sure you want to choose that character? Yes, I do want to choose that character. The load is complete. We want to press a button to make that go away. Okay, sounds good. Now the next character has to choose it. You go all the way through and do all of this. And then even when you're ready to start playing, then my brother had to go in and invert the y-axis because that's how he likes to play. So every single time we wanted to play the game together, this is what we had to do. We got very quick at doing this, as much as we could, but it doesn't really make sense for this to happen every single time. This is not like a rare use case. This is something that happens fairly frequently. And so one example from the interaction design world where I think this is done really well is in the Wells Fargo ATM. And so essentially what goes on here is it figures out the actions that you do all the time, like, oh, I'm getting this cash from my account, I'm getting $60, or I'm getting $100, and I want a receipt. And even though that's only 3 steps, they said, you know what, we're going to make that process super easy and make that a favorite button on the left side. And so immediately, every time you come in and you walk up to the ATM, press one button, walk away. And so they've really sped up that interaction. And I think this is the idea of speeding up those interactions over time. Another example of a game that does a good job at providing something that allows people to speed up their interactions over time can be seen in Dragon Age. And so essentially, Dragon Age employs this design pattern of the pie menu, which is it's a great tool to let people increase their speed over time. And so I don't know if you're familiar with how this paradigm works, but the idea is that you press a button and that activates that sort of radial circle in the beginning. And in the beginning, it takes a little bit of time. You have to figure out, well, what are all these different things? Like, oh, okay, that one's spells, that one's potions. And so you figure out, okay, the right side is spells, and when you activate that, then it shows you a submenu. Okay, which spell do you want? And then you say, oh, the fireball I want to cast is down. And so you press that. And so now you've kind of learned, okay, I went right and I went down and got it. And so then the next time you want to come in and cast it again, you kind of remember, oh, it's right and then down, right and then down, right and then down. It gets a lot faster. And so it really pays off over time to be able to let you repeat these actions. It does a great job at letting you speed up those interactions over time. Dragon Age goes even one step further, where they allow you to actually bind one of those spells to a button on the joystick. So that goes even one further. You don't even have to go to the submenus. You can take your most favorite ones and bind them to a button. And so that's a great example of helping to speed people's interactions over time. The next concept we have here, this heuristic, is avoiding conceptually conflicting inputs. And so essentially, there's a challenge that comes inherent when you're designing games in the sense that you only have so many buttons on your joystick, and you have a lot of actions that you want people to perform. And ironically, even though there's even more buttons on game systems, with the exception of the Wii, you still have a lot of actions that you're wanting to do, even more than there are buttons. And so essentially what that means is that you have to assign multiple actions to one button. And this can be fine in a lot of cases, but in some cases not so much. And so here's an example where I was playing the game Red Dead Redemption. And in this game, you're this cowboy and you're going around. And it turns out that just riding your horse around can have a lot of drama going on with it in the sense that you might get robbed or there might be somebody stopping by. And so the thought is, well, one way to get from one place to another is instead have a nice leisurely ride on this carriage. And so the thought is like, okay, great. I'm going to take a nice relaxed ride. And so if you press triangle, you're going to go ahead and ride as carriage. But it turns out that if you are just a little bit of an angle off to the left and you press the same button, this is what happens. Great, I'm now wanted, and I just wanted to ride in my carriage to my next town, and now I have to escape the law. I have to, and I've got a bounty on my head, and so they made the same exact button for take a pleasant ride as hijack carriage, and so so you can see how these are pretty much conceptually conflicting. There's another example John Mark told me about from Fallout 3, where essentially they have it so that the button will perform an action whenever you're pointing it at something, and so oftentimes you'll press that button to shoot at enemies, but that same button to talk to a small child is used, and so he's got some trepidation. He's like, I'm gonna press this. I really hope it doesn't shoot you. So this is an example of conceptually conflicting inputs. And so I thought about it, and I think there's one idea for how you might go about avoiding these is essentially try to map out these buttons. Like once you've taken a first pass, you can kind of map these out as a table. Put all the X buttons, all the squares, all the triangles, all the circles, and then the idea is that in a column, you take a lens and say, all right, we'll think about peaceful and violent actions, or forward and backwards. There's some sort of like nice general things, and go through and code it, and you'll notice that in the triangle section, we have ride as passenger and hijack carriages, like these two conflicting things, and so maybe you can say, okay, this might be a little bit weird. Maybe I should move these to a different action. So this is an example of a kind of maybe a tool that you could use to help avoid this. The next heuristic is about providing immersive cues. And so the idea here is that games are trying to connect people with this virtual representation of themselves. And so what you want to do is to try to make users aware of their status and their impact on the world and whenever these change. And if there's ever any kind of ambiguity between those, then that connection becomes weaker. And so in general, it's a good idea to try to provide more of these cues unless you're consciously trying to hide that. And so a couple of examples for this is in the game of Street Fighter II. So in this one, essentially, the job is to break this car, right? And so you're trying to destroy the car, and you only have so much time. Now, how much is the car gone? Is it almost gone? Like it looks pretty broken. No, it's still not broken yet. And so you're still hitting away. You're hitting away. Like, it's not done, or you don't know if you should be nervous, or you're feeling like you're almost there. It's really kind of ambiguous. And so in this case, there's not really a great connection between, like, well, how much further do I have to go? There's that disconnect between the user and the game world. One example where this was done, where this is actually being done well, is in the Gears of War 2. And this is actually kind of a pattern that you're seeing emulated in other first-person shooters, where before, anytime you were getting shot, you just got this sort of vague, wow, my health is going down and my character is screaming, but I don't really know where these shots are coming from. And so what they did is, if you see that little red arc, they're showing you like the general direction of being shot. And so the idea is that, okay, somebody in front of you is shooting you. Whereas if it's on the bottom part, you better turn around because somebody's shooting you from behind. And this is actually a design pattern that I think is being used by other games as well, to help you get that sense of, okay, where is this coming from? And you're strengthening that connection between the user and the game that they're playing. And so now John Mark's going to talk about some more heuristics.
Cool, great. So this next heuristic I'm calling distinguish active from inactive. So I think as we sort of grow up in the real world does a really good job of teaching us what can be moved, what can be pushed, what can be lifted and clicked and turned on. And we're really good as humans about learning these rules and picking up on these patterns and being able to apply them to new objects we find. We don't need to be told every time we see a different type of switch the basic pattern we need to apply. In the UI world, we tend to sort of lump this kind of patterns into something we call affordances. I had a little bit of difficulty applying the word affordances to games because I have examples involving shrubs, and I didn't really think it made sense to talk about shrubs having affordance. So I was trying to create a more generalized way of speaking of this, and so I'm just going to call it sort of active from inactive. But because games sort of are limited in what they can represent in the real world, maybe by choice and maybe by sort of just limitations of what we can do in technology, we almost always have to sort of create a subset of this. And so when you're creating this game, you either have to build upon rules that we already know inherently as humans, or you have to find quick ways of teaching people these new rules. So in this example, this is a picture from Fallout 3 New Vegas, and it's a very rich and lush landscape. And I could ask you all sort of, okay, which of these plants are interactive? Which of things in this environment can I actually touch or pick up or interact with? And you may say it's the tall plants, you may say it's the shiny ones, you may say it's all of them, maybe the little bushes. In this particular example, it turns out I was searching for a very small root on the ground, and basically the only way I could discover that root was actually by moving my cursor in sort of a grid-like pattern over the screen until I watched the little action text change from nothing to pick up root or something like that. And so in this case, I was forced to sort of relearn what rules applied to this world, what plants could be harvested, and which ones are basically just there for atmosphere. So, and I sort of see this problem only getting worse as texture maps become richer and more detailed, and we add more and more sort of realism and stuff into the games. We really need to you need to be aware of creating this distinction between things that are actually active and things that are just there as set pieces. I think another example of this is in Peggle. Peggle often uses these very detailed background patterns to create variety within the game. But what this means is each time one of these background patterns is loaded up, a player is asked to basically quickly identify what are the key properties of objects on the screen, what things will the ball bounce off of and what things won't it. And so Peggle had to build in cues to sort of help make this easy so that players wouldn't have to do a lot of trial and error. In this case, they use a strong drop shadow. This sort of helps indicate that the ball will bounce off of things. But looking at this particular screen, I could ask you, well, is it the ball going to bounce off the smoke that's coming out of the dragon's mouth? Well, as it turns out, it does. And you could say, well, maybe that's identifiable by the obscuring of the dots, or maybe the fact that the smoke has a drop shadow. But then the next question, will it bounce off the dragon? Clearly, the two sort of by just gestalt are sort of connected and maybe part of the same object, but they obviously don't share all the same principles. So in this case, it actually doesn't. It passes right through the dragon. And so you have to make sure that you are consistent about applying these rules so that people can begin to adapt these patterns and apply them. And especially when it's important that you are able to make these decisions quickly, then these rules need to be clearly identifiable. In the web, we actually had to struggle with the same challenges. People were not sort of born inherently with the idea of knowing how to click on links and navigate a web page. So we had to develop these new affordances, and so we established these patterns and conventions like the underline and the blue link to help distinguish parts from the page which are active versus those that are not active. And so now every time you visit a new page, you don't have to relearn that convention. You all can sort of take a look at this eBay page, and most of you can guess at least like 90% of the things that are actually going to provide an action and things that are just static. And so the web has done a very good job of sort of establishing those patterns. In World of Warcraft, which also has sort of a rich, detailed backdrop of flora and fauna, but it actually sort of, part of the gameplay hinges upon being able to distinguish things that are actually valuable within that landscape. So Blizzard identifies these with a sort of sparkling animation. Now, it doesn't really convey very well in a screenshot, but this particular bush you can see actually sort of has sparkles that come off of it. And so what they've done is created this pattern for users so they can quickly distinguish which objects are going to be interactive and which ones are just actually there as part of the scenery. And the great thing is that now they've established this pattern for things like bushes and mining nodes. They can now actually apply it to anything they want. And so suddenly, like a barrel or a chair that used to be part of the set actually can now sort of like stand out to the foreground and become instantly recognizable as something that's active within the environment. Another way of doing this, it doesn't have to be as heavy-handed as the sparkles, but EverQuest 2 went with this convention where everything that is active actually has a label on top of it. So a player or an NPC or a monster all have sort of a tag over the top that identifies who they are. And they've actually taken that a step forward and sort of applied that pattern to things that are actually static things within the environment. So if a rock or a plant is interactive, then they actually sort of label that as well. So quickly you sort of develop this pattern that if it has a name above it, then it's something you can interact with. I don't want to spend too much time, I think, talking about how heuristics can be broken deliberately for effect, but I did want to point out this particular one. I think some games actually can use this ambiguity that's created as part of a game mechanic. So in adventure games, like in this case Monkey Island, part of the game is actually trying to figure out which items within this rich and detailed landscape are usable and which ones will help you sort of solve puzzles. But just sort of as a word of caution that this should be done with a very deliberate eye and using it without that sort of caution, you end up creating this situation where you're basically hunting for a pixel within a large landscape, and that quickly can move into the realm of frustration. This next heuristic I'm calling prevent surprise errors, and I think this is probably one of the more meta ones that we'll be talking about just because it sort of applies to a lot of them, but specifically looking at unexpected situations where errors arise. So challenges, as Corey mentioned earlier, challenges and those implied risks that come with them are very much part of games. That's sort of what builds up to the epic win moment, and having a very real risk of failure, I think, is sort of a large part of what makes games satisfying eventually when you complete them. And so exploring through this trial and error is not a gameplay mechanic that we ever want to get rid of. I think where this becomes problematic from a UI standpoint is when this failure comes at unexpected times. And so these tend to happen during very mundane tasks, maybe during inventory management and customer characterization. Maybe you're doing metagame activities such as saving or loading files. Maybe you're looking at your map. Maybe you're tracking your progress or something like these. And it's sort of assumed as a player that these activities carry no risk. And so it's in these particular sort of mundane tasks that you have to be extra careful about introducing these surprise errors. So I think of getting dressed as a good example of a sort of mundane task that you don't expect to have any errors in it. In this case, before my character goes on her dungeon delve, she puts on all the various equipment, and I consider this a very mundane activity that I wouldn't expect to have any risk. However, in this case, actually, I made an error, and the error is very subtle, but it turns out I wasn't wearing any pants. And so the game system knew this, and I knew this, the game system knew this, I didn't know this, so there was little reason for it not to convey this information to me. There isn't a particularly good game reason why I should be fighting in this dungeon without any pants, yet I'm provided no feedback to that situation, no error message. I think another key component of this heuristic is this idea of trying to identify and prevent non-recoverable errors. So from a UI standpoint, we talk a lot about non-recoverable errors as being the primary ones you want to avoid because, as by definition, it's difficult to return from that state if you make a mistake. And again, using another World of Warcraft example, and I promise the whole deck isn't full of them, if you drag an item into empty space and you let go of it, it actually initiates sort of a deletion sequence which ends up deleting that item. And so because the game actually relies on that drag-drop mechanic for a lot of things, including sort of moving your inventory around and putting on equipment, you can imagine that particular drag-drop UI is actually ripe for mistakes. And so this accidental deletion is rather catastrophic since you can't get this item back. And so what they've done is they've thrown up a confirmation dialog box when this happens. And so this helps. I think a better solution is to try to make all errors of this type where possible recoverable. I think everyone's familiar with the way undo works. Certainly if you're typing in a Word document in Microsoft Word and you highlight a word or something like that and hit delete, the word deletes and you don't have to, there's no confirmation dialog box that comes up and says, are you sure you want to delete that word? But rather what they do is they've built in this system of undo so you can actually recover easily from that error. So if it turns out you didn't mean to delete that word, you can just click on the undo action and get that back. And so games are beginning to develop this notion as well, and sometimes this fits in well. In this Dragon Age example, if you find yourself accidentally having sold a lot of your items to the vendor, and basically sort of a destructive act like changing, for those who haven't played a lot of role-playing games, it's basically changing your loot that you found for money. You may at some point realize you didn't mean to do that. You had buyer's remorse or seller's remorse. You didn't mean to get rid of that item. And so what they've done is they've actually created this undo paradigm where you can actually go to a specific tab within the screen and get those items back. So they've taken what would have otherwise been unrecoverable and actually made that recoverable. The next heuristic I want to talk about is something I'm just calling be game state aware. I think it's important for your game to be sort of a little bit self-aware, and I don't mean like Skynet, but just this notion of being able to provide the right information to players at the right time. So don't expose all the data at once, don't expose everything at once, but look for ways of progressively disclosing the information and let players actually control the information that gets shown and let them dig deeper into particular areas of the game that they want to learn more about and want to find out more information about. So not to sort of cast too many dispersions on the printed manual, but I think the traditional printed manual is a great resource, but has two major shortcomings. And I think the first one is that obviously it takes players out of the flow of the game. So if you're playing a game and you need to find out how to do something and it requires you going to a manual, obviously you're going to have to put down the controller and pick up the booklet and read about how to do that. And so obviously you want to avoid that. I think the second major shortcoming is the one that I want to focus on, which is the fact that the manual is actually fairly dumb. It really has no notion of the current state of your game. It doesn't really understand the context of the player. And so it can't use any of that information to help filter out the data and provide something that might be more valuable to the user. A sort of a good example of this, I believe, is the Civilization 4 tech tree, which really does go out of its way to provide context-relevant information for the user. So when a player initiates this tree, it brings up this tree of telling them what technologies they can pursue. It focuses in the player's attention on the particular area that's very appropriate for them. So it sort of jumps to the right part in the timeline where that information is going to be really relevant. In addition, what is done here is you can kind of see it's actually highlighted the objectives that have not yet been met. And so you can see the little red X's to indicate that current condition doesn't exist. And so if a user is particularly looking to how to follow a particular path, then they can easily identify what are the key pieces they want to learn more about. And so compare this to sort of the raw information dump that a printed manual might be. Another sort of example of this is that you can actually use progressive disclosure in the form of tooltips to help people really control the way that they expose the information. So I think we do this a lot in the web. I think everyone's very familiar with sort of alt tags and tooltips and stuff like that. But games can actually use this as well. And from a UI standpoint, it's actually a great thing because it allows the player to really drive the flow of information. So in Civilization, a player may indicate her desire to learn more about the watermill, and so she moves the mouse over the watermill icon, and you get this little pop-up, this hover layer that provides additional information that's contextually appropriate to them. So in this case, it's really sort of focusing on what the game knows is the most relevant data and what the user is really interested in learning about. I'm calling this one Reading is Easier than Remembering. I think this actually goes by a lot of different names, and it's something that we're probably all sort of inherently aware of. But and I actually think the game industry does a really good job of this one. But I think it's just important to highlight this heuristic nonetheless, because I do think it is really important. And certainly as games and information systems get more and more complex, then we really have to be smart about what we ask the user to remember and what we ask them to keep track of in their head versus what we can help them keep track of within the state of the application or the game. So it really gets down to this idea of reducing the cognitive load. Games get more complex, so we need to find more ways of reducing this complexity. Again, sort of taking a little bit of a cheap shot at the printed manuals, but if anyone remembers the old days of Street Fighter II, where each of these special moves requires a sort of complex, elaborate button combination, and so what you had to do to learn these button combinations was to refer to your printed manual, and like that was basically the source of the information. You could ask your friend, or it might be written on the side of the arcade machine or something, but it certainly wasn't easily discoverable, and it was sort of like all at once, and you basically had to remember that and transfer it to an actual game situation. None of it was provided contextually. And a more recent example, looking at Minecraft, and they've actually sort of taken to the first step. So what they've done is something that we see a lot these days, which is create a sort of action bar that maps, hopefully, to the physical layout of your keyboard. So you can sort of see at the bottom there's a row of buttons, basically, and you can ascribe different actions to those buttons. And they're laid out in a line that sort of matches roughly where your numbers might be on a typical keyboard. And the idea is that each one of those boxes maps to a particular number. And so you get a little bit of that physical cue because you can see that the layout is similar. But in this case, without clear labels, it can actually be difficult to remember the mapping, and it can be challenging to remember whether dropping that stone block is actually number 4 or is it number 5. Like, it's sort of roughly in that middle area, but you don't know exactly where. I think a really good example, and one of my favorite examples to look at, is Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. In this case, they've created this really beautiful sort of visual mnemonic that helps map the actions with sort of a key button layout on the screen that actually matches very well with the controller itself. So the visual representation that's displayed on the screen not only provides useful information like how much ammo you have left or something like that, but it also is a quick reminder as what keys do what actions. And so it's beautifully mirrored both in sort of color as well as layout. And so it really becomes easy for people to learn how to use this, and really becomes a quicker learning process for people. As games get more complex, especially in sort of the role-playing world and the MMO world, modern games often ask players to remember a large number of disparate tasks and keep track of all these objectives that they want you to accomplish. So we're always looking for ways to sort of like help simplify this and help keep track of this. So a lot of games have sort of adopted this notion of having like markers on a little map at the corner. It shows them like roughly where they're supposed to be going. They may have a little to-do list basically that tells them how far they're progressing in any particular action. And so looking for these things to help sort of reduce the amount that you're asking a player to actually physically remember is a great way of sort of easing the burden of the player so they can focus more on enjoying the game. And of course, these goals don't have to be quite as blatant as a literal to-do list. You can use more subtle environmental cues such as color and animation and sound. In Mirror's Edge, they actually do have a very elegant solution where they use color to sort of highlight the objective of where the player is going. So, they could have told the player, hey, you have to run to that tower, and just sort of hope that the player remembers where they're supposed to be going. But instead, they've actually they use color to sort of remind them, like, hey, this is the direction you're supposed to be going. So it sort of eased the burden there, and I think made the game more enjoyable because of it. This next heuristic I'm just basically calling Remember Real Life. I think it's easy to think that your game is always going to be played in sort of optimal settings and optimal conditions with ideal hardware, lighting, and the player giving 100% focus to the game all the time. And I know as UI designers, we suffer from the exact same thing. We sort of imagine that users are just doing one task at the time, like they're fully focused, there's no distractions, and no kids crying in the background or minimize windows or things like that. And so it's really sort of important to remember what the real contexts are that people are playing your game in. And I think the iPhone and sort of the iOS platform does a really good job of sort of remembering that, hey, the user actually may be doing lots of other things right now and probably not just playing your game. And so, I could be enjoying a good game of Dungeon Raiders and, suddenly I get a call, and so I can quickly hit the home button, or in this case, the call will actually pop forward, and suddenly, I'm back into this different context. And so there's no notion of having to save or find the quit button or camp for 20 seconds or anything like that. And so it's really taken to heart this notion that the mobile platform may not be for extended 100% focused play session. So just sort of keeping in mind, if you're doing sort of a console game where you think you'll have more attention, just remember that don't make it too onerous to quit out. Maybe make like a way of having a quick save or something like that, so you can really sort of quickly get in and out of that game if something comes up. And I think that ends up making the whole experience better for the user. I sort of hesitated about this because the topic of accessibility, I think, could be an entire conference, if not at least an entire discussion on its own. But just remember sort of the other limitations that come into playing situations. So, maybe sound is not an option for your player. Maybe they're red-green colorblind. Maybe there's other issues going on. So where possible, if you can provide these sort of secondary cues, or if you can provide some way of supporting that, larger fonts is a great example of something we do on the web to sort of allow people who have less sighted abilities, then we can sort of make things a little bit easier for everyone. And so just keeping that in mind as you're developing your game is great. And so I wanted to talk about this one, which is, I struggled with whether it was actually a heuristic or not, but I think it is, and you can disagree with me later at the end of this talk, but this notion of reducing cognitive breaks or cognitive dissonance within your game. So I'm not really talking about sort of Genova Chen's notion of flow, although that is important, but thinking about what's the holistic experience of your game and whether it feels like it's all part of one system, or whether it feels like there's these hard breaks in it. And so to illustrate a bad example, I want to actually talk about the website that I work on, so I can take full responsibility for this. This notion that, so we're trying to sell you basically this silver package, and so we have this page where we talk about all the details of this product and how it compares to all the different ones. We have this large call to action which says, get YOLA Silver now, and so you click on this. And we're great, this is great. We love the fact that you're interested. Here, let's tell you even more. You want to drill down a little bit, like we can tell you even more about the details of what you're going to get, really trying to sell the user. And so, we've lured them in. This is definitely what they want to do. They click Get YOLA Silver now. and suddenly they're dropped in this blank sign-up screen. And so there's no more context of the silver. It doesn't sort of congratulate them for making this choice. Like, this is the same page we show almost everyone who's trying to sign up or create an account. And so it really feels like this is this cognitive break, and we really can see the impact on this in the numbers. There's a lot of drop-off at this stage. And so this happens in games as well, I think. In this Dragon Age example, you've got a beautiful scenery and lots of little doors and nooks and crannies in this dwarven town, and you're encouraging the user to go and explore and click on all the doors. Unfortunately, as a player is wandering around, he sees an interesting door, clicks on the door, and suddenly you're presented with this loading screen. And so, obviously nobody likes a loading screen, but it's just important to think about how this is impacting the flow of the user, as well as sort of what this is doing to their behavior. So actually what's happening here is you're creating a little bit of a negative feedback loop. And what this can end up doing is sort of discouraging the player from exploring, because every time they see a door, they may think, well, maybe I want to know what's behind it. But they know that between them and exploring this, there's potentially this 1 to 10 second loading screen that they have to sit through. And so just being aware of how this is going to impact behavior, and if you want to encourage people to explore, obviously look for ways of reducing this. I think, obviously, sometimes you can't avoid this at all. I think Fallout 3 does a fairly good job of sort of trying to keep their loading screens within context of the game. So you do encounter these loading screens fairly frequently, but at least at the time they provide you with a little bit of contextually relevant information. So it has your current progress through a level. It has some interesting statistics about how many corpses you've eaten and how many books you read and things like that. So all of this at least is trying to keep them engaged and trying to keep them feel like they're still relevant and still part of that game world. And then obviously, when impossible, try to avoid these transitions altogether. So if you can create a game which actually is sort of seamless and doesn't have a notion of levels, and that death is a very sort of seamless transition to starting again, that's obviously sort of an ideal state to be in. So I think we have one more heuristic.
Yeah, so the last heuristic we thought made sense to bring up at this point. We've talked a lot about things that you can add to the experience to try to help to prevent these unanticipated negative experiences. But it's important to also bear in mind, this balance that you're trying to strike, where what can you take away, and just sort of bringing up the Tufte quote, which I think captures it well, where the idea is, a designer knows when he's reached perfection, not when there's nothing left to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. And so essentially, you want to make sure that the interface elements don't have information which is irrelevant or rarely needed, and be careful about Chrome creep. So where it's I just add a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. So some examples. Somebody who actually has done a pretty good job of this. When Blizzard first came out with Diablo 1, you can see the Chrome, or sort of the bottom display area, is taking up about 30% of the screen. But then as they made number 2, it actually went down into about 25% of the screen. And then when they actually are from what I can tell from Diablo 3 upcoming, it's even less. And so you can see just how much they've been trying to peel that back and really focus in on the main area here. So just bear in mind that really what people care about is that action, what's happening to my character, what's going on in that main area, and you need to make sure that that's given enough emphasis. So one example where, it's maybe too far to say it's a bad example, but just to be a little controversial, StarCraft 2, which is a great game, I love it. But there are potentially some opportunities here, and I just wanted to show you sort of how this might feel if you follow this rigidly. So the idea here is in StarCraft 2, if you're not familiar, is that you have your main display area, and so essentially, you're controlling these different things here, and this is sort of the display area here. And some of these elements are certainly essential, for gameplay. And so this little mini map shows what's going on in the whole area, and that's really important as you're playing the game. But then the question is is everything totally necessary? And one of the areas here, this is actually something that will change contextually. So when you click on this building, it'll show a set of actions. When you click on this character, it'll show a set of actions. And when you first start out the game, yes, it is something that is important because they can figure it out. However, as you progress, and this is actually a game that's played competitively all over the world, and the experts actually become really, really good at knowing every single keyboard shortcut that you'd need to be able to access any of those elements. So then the question becomes, what might you gain if you, say, allowed those more advanced players to say, you know what, I don't need that part of the Chrome. And so you might be able to see, oh, I'm actually being attacked by a bunch of these guys, which before that was kind of covered up, and now we've given a little bit more of that display space. So I apologize for the bad photoshopping work, but hopefully it gives you an idea of what you might be able to gain from this sort of thing. One example of a game that I think does a great job of doing this is in Dead Space, where essentially they just took all that Chrome away and they just integrated it into the game experience. And so actually you see on the backpack those little bars actually mean how much health the person has. And so rather than sort of doing the typical, oh, here's a whole area of the screen, we're going to show you health, they've just sort of integrated it into the play space itself. And so you can see just how much that changes the overall feeling of the game.
Great. So I think the idea of showing these heuristics in the detail is we want to actually put them forward as a possible tool set. We know that like every industry, the game industry has a lot of constraints on it. A lot of people work really hard with very short deadlines and trying to really get something out to market quickly. And so, we know that not everyone has time for a full usability study with a use of a beautiful usability lab and things like that. And so we were really sort of design this talk in hopefully a way that people can take away some useful tools that they can use when they don't have time for the full study. And so we're sort of grouping the heuristics as part of this notion of what we're calling discount usability techniques, so things that you can do sort of quickly and get some good results. And so Corey mentioned the sort of button mapping as a way. I think the heuristics are a great example. And I definitely don't want to downplay the importance of just getting somebody in front of your system, whether it's a game or whether it's not a game, just watching somebody who doesn't know it use it. So whether it's a friend or a family member or just somebody down the hall who's not in your office, just watch them play it. And I think the secret here, and there's a lot of people who can talk to this a lot better than I can, but the secret is really just sort of watch what they do more than what they tell you, because you'll really begin to learn a lot about what their sort of expected behavior is and where they fail and where they're having trouble. And so just sort of even doing that just with one or two people is going to be greatly helpful. So hopefully together with the heuristics and everything we've talked about, those provide some sort of discount usability techniques that you can use. With that, we want to thank everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun. And it looks like we actually have some time to have questions and discussion. So if anyone has anything they want to talk about, whether they agree or disagree or have some new heuristics for us, please step up to the mic and we'd love to talk with you. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks for the great info. It was great. I just wanted to ask a question a little bit out of the box. Manuals and info within games just focus how the game should function, but there's apart from good gaming, there's also good gamers, right? Mm-hmm. Could you tell me how user interface could teach players how to be a good gamer, mm-hmm. and instead of games being a right platform for all gamers, because user interface is mainly focused about common behavior instead of behavior on an individual basis. So.
Yeah, no, totally. No, I think it's a great question. Obviously, I think there are a lot of different ways that games approach this issue. I think as humans we learn really well from other humans, and so I think a lot of way that we sort of learn gaming techniques and how to become more proficient from games is actually watching other people do that. And so a lot of games actually sort of build in this sort of ability to watch other people through replays or to sort of sit in and watch maps. I know StarCraft 2 does a good example of this, where you can sort of watch replay videos of famous StarCraft 2 players, and really I think people learn a lot from watching those kind of actions. If that's not an option, if it's a single-player game, the notion of having sort of ghosts that sort of you can observe their behavior is done a lot. I know racing games sometimes do this, and you can sort of like track to see like, oh, this is how they handled that curve, or this is how they handled that jump. And so I think there are a lot of sort of clever ways that people use video and things like that to really sort of educate people along the way.
Yeah, I think it is an interesting question, and actually one of the things that's done within gaming, which is kind of a no-no in the interaction design world, actually, is the whole question of asking people to self-identify themselves. And so you'll see applications that will say, "Oh, are you a designer or are you a developer?" And so you say, "Oh, okay, I have to pick one," and then the whole experience will change because of what you chose. And to me, some of the the common question that's asked in video games, which is, "Oh, what level are you?" Self-identify can be kind of challenging, and I think one good thing is that games have evolved to where they'll notice, like, "Oh, you said you were really good, but you're dying a lot. So maybe are you sure you want us to tone it down a little bit?" And so trying to adjust, and so maybe a good idea is to try to identify people from their behavior. And I think there are sites out there that do this. For example, Yelp being aware of, like, good Lord, this person's writing a ton of reviews. Let's give them this elite status and say, "Hey, guess what? You've unlocked some new functionality because you look like you're this kind of person." So it's more about having a system that adapts to somebody as opposed to asking them to self-identify.
Cool. Next question.
Okay. I'm a math teacher, so one of my things, games in the classroom. So you mentioned consider the real world when you're designing a game. So how would a classroom environment, how might a classroom environment affect how I should design a interface? Like if I want to make a math game or something like that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I definitely consider sort of the math classroom as being the real world. I think it depends on what your objective is in terms of, I think if you want to sort of maintain control over the situation, do you want to have a game that's played in very short segments so that you can sort of bring the class back together and continue your lecture or something like that? Maybe you... how else would you sort of present that? But just looking for ways, figuring out what sort of the idea behavior is you want to have, and then sort of build your game sort of supporting that kind of behavior. So, as I said, if you want to have a lot of time where you're presenting to the class, then don't make sort of hour-long chunks of gameplay, which would require it difficult to break up.
Yeah, I think part of it is just going through an exercise, which is good, for any interaction design exercise, to think, okay, if I'm making something that's for students in a classroom, what is their environment? Okay, so what, can I expect that the teacher will say, all right, start of class, boom, start this game up, or is it likely to actually be happening somewhat in the middle of the class? Well, how long do classes take? And when that bell rings, what happens to students? Do they sort of immediately leave the system, or do we need to find some way of easily letting them save their progress and get out of there because they want to hurry up to the next class because it's on the other side of the classroom? Or how do they feel about the other students? Or are they sitting next to their friends? And how would that impact the fact that they're playing this game if they're sitting next to somebody else? And so it's really looking at all those things and thinking them through and how that would impact what you're building.
Okay, thanks. Those are some good thoughts.
Right. Thanks.
Hi. So I don't have a very specific question, but I was wondering if you'd be willing to speak on or address the tension with game guides and games. So I know that for a long time, to seriously play World of Warcraft with any sort of efficacy, you had to have like 6 different add-ons that point you where to go. But I noticed in recent design iterations, they've started integrating a lot of those features and kind of accepting that people are going to use these guides and sort of embracing them. So I know that in some cases that breaks things. So what's your opinion on that tension? I'll sit down. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, it's a good question. I think that actually applies really well to almost all UI design. Sort of observing how people end up using your system and being adaptable to that. So, you definitely we have the greatest intentions when you're building your designs. You think you know how people are going to use the system, especially if it involves a large number of people. You set your expectations and you build your system around that. Inevitably, what ends up happening is that behaviors emerge and people use it for entirely different things that you never expected it to. And so this happens a little bit in games as well. Like people build, certainly in World of Warcraft, build these amazing plugins that sort of added all these new features on top of it. And so I think Blizzard, actually, to their credit, was very good at sort of rolling with that. And I mean, they could have just decided, hey, like, this is our game, this is the way it's going to stay, we'll just block all this sort of like user-generated content. But instead, they sort of said, hey, these are actually really good ideas and may help everyone along the way. And I think that, in general, like, it's a good philosophy for game design in general, is that, being adaptive and seeing like, hey, this is what people are doing. And you may decide that, hey, this actually behavior dramatically ruins the experience for someone. It's not something you want to support. So maybe you do make a conscious effort to prevent that. But at least being open to the notion that your game is going to be a dynamic system and that people are unpredictable inherently. So just being aware of that and being adaptable, I think, is great. Cool. It sounds like it's it. Thanks so much, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.